Here we see the results of the First World War. The youth of all the Christian nations dead and maimed. The Christian nations in huge debt to the Jewish bankers. The monarchies of Germany, Austria and Russia were destroyed, and Lord Balfour Agreement gives Palestine to the Jews. Here we see Rosa Luxemburg, the Jewess. By means of this world revolution, the power of Jewry will be established over all nations of the world. Here we see Bela Kun, the leader of the Hungarian Soviet Republic. Jew Bela Kun brings revolution to Hungary. In the spring of 1919, Bela Kun usurped power in Hungary. Bela Kun's dictatorship lasted only 3 months, but during that time, tens of thousands of Christians, they were Roman Catholics, were ruthlessly murdered. The New International Yearbook of 1919 says in part, the government of Bela Kun was composed almost exclusively of Jews.
Politicians, major industrialists, and the military, unable to reach a compromise with the Tsar, gravitated to the idea of a conspiracy. Many of them, political adversaries in the open, were allied behind the scenes, all members of a secret Freemason brotherhood, the Great East of Peoples of Russia. Founded in St. Petersburg about 1912, the organization was controlled by a Supreme Council and had more than 300 members.
By the late fall of 1917, Lenin and his Bolsheviks were poised to seize power. The location is genuine enough, but the film's depiction of the famous storming is remembered differently by some. The provisional government was destroyed, but the damage to the palace consisted of chipped paintwork and a broken window. Kerensky managed to flee Petrograd, never to return.
Alexander Kerensky became head of the Supreme Council. He and other Great East members nurtured a plan of an anti-Tsarist coup.
The Bolsheviks were now the rulers of Russia. But it split the country. In the south, an anti-Bolshevik white army came into being. It was immediately countered by a Bolshevik red army. A civil war was brewing, in which the Bolsheviks' main weapon was coercion, the Red Terror. In Tobolsk, Nicholas eventually heard of the disintegration of his Russia. Nobody knows for sure whether the family realized their fate. Enter Yakov Yurovsky, the Romanovs' new warden. At 1:30 a.m. on July 17th, the family was woken up by Yurovsky and told to prepare to move once again. They were led into a small basement room. There, the 11 prisoners, the family and a small retinue, were suddenly confronted by 11 armed men. There had only been time for incoherent exclamations. Both Yurovsky and one of the guards, Medvedev, recorded in legal depositions their versions of what had happened.
Pavel Medvedev. All the members of the Tsar's family were lying on the floor, very severely wounded. The blood was running in streams.
Yakov Yurovsky. I myself killed Nicholas point blank. Alexandra Fyodorovna died immediately. Alexei and 3 of his sisters were still alive. We had to finish them off. We tried to bayonet one of the girls, but the bayonet would not penetrate her corsage. We undressed the girl and found a corset, torn in places by bullets.
Pavel Medvedev. The heir to the throne was still alive and mourning a little. Yurovsky fired 2 or 3 times at him. Then the air was still.
This telegram to the bosses in Moscow announced in a prearranged code that the whole family was dead. And the Tsar's family was not alone. Every Romanov the Bolsheviks could find, they murdered. Nicholas's brother Michael, 9 uncles and cousins, and Alexandra's sister Ella, 18 Romanovs in all. For years it was debated what part, if any, Lenin had played in ordering the execution of Nicholas and his family. The local Bolsheviks appeared to have carried out the murders on their own initiative, but it now seems clear that it was on orders from Lenin.
I often wondered why Hitler was anti-Semitic. I always asked questions at school and never got a satisfactory answer. But there was a reason why Hitler was anti-Semitic, because he knew what the international Jewish bankers were doing. He knew that they were causing the revolution in Russia and in Germany and all the other European nations. And here the Catholic priests saw Hitler as God's providence. God's holy providence has provided that in a decisive hour he, Hitler, be entrusted with the leadership of the German people. Now we see Germany's troops are now armed to fight against Bolshevism and the Jewish money power. Catholic paper claims Hitler would save humanity from the Jews. The Nazi movement for freeing the world from the Jews is a movement for the renaissance of human dignity. The all-wise and almighty God is behind this movement. Father Franjo Prelic in Zagreb, a Catholic newspaper, 1941. So there was a reaction where the church saw the obvious evils of Freemasonry, the Jewish money power and communism and Bolshevism, and they united. Hitler was a Catholic, and here we see him meeting one of the heads of the Catholic Church.
The entire conspiracy, as Hitler knew, is Jewish in origin. That's where it comes from. And that's why Hitler is the most demonized person in history, because when you go up against the greatest liars in history and you lose, you're going to become the most lied about man in history.
dieses Volk hinzutreten und billige Versprechungen zu geben. In uns selbst allein liegt die Zukunft des deutschen Volkes. Wenn wir selbst dieses deutsche Volk emporführen durch eine Arbeit, durch einen Fleiß, einen Entschlossenheit, einen Trotz, eine Beharrlichkeit.
Providence has ordained that I should be the greatest liberator of humanity. I am freeing man from a false vision called conscience and morality. The Ten Commandments have lost their validity. Conscience is a Jewish invention. It is a blemish. The heaviest blow which struck humanity was Christianity. Bolshevism is Christianity's illegitimate child. Both are the inventions of the Jew. The struggle for world domination is between me and the Jews. All else is meaningless.
Because when you go up against the greatest liars in history and you lose, you're going to become the most lied about man in history.
After the war, the Allies continued to blockade Germany, and the returning troops who marched through Munich, the capital of Bavaria, were shocked to discover how much their families were still suffering. Millions of Germans were hungry, and thousands more were dying of tuberculosis and influenza. Politics were polarized. Conservatives and socialists each became radical in the face of crisis. With the whole of Germany in turmoil in the spring of 1919, the unrest in Munich resulted in a left-wing takeover of the city, the Räterepublik. This culminated in April 1919 in the Munich Soviet Republic, an attempt to create a Soviet-style government of the city only 18 months after the victory of the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union. Government troops were sent in to quash the rebellion, and there was open fighting on the streets of Munich. More than than 500 people were killed. The soldiers were supported by the Freikorps, right-wing mercenaries paid for by the government. In Munich, there were cases where the Freikorps simply shot members of the Räterepublik out of hand. Other Freikorps members, like Fridolin von Spaun, heartily approved of the brutal measures which were being used to suppress the communist revolutionaries throughout Germany.
Es klingt vielleicht sehr roh, aber ich konnte ihnen keine Tränen nachweinen. Es war der gerechte Lohn. Sie wollten Deutschland ins Chaos stürzen. Und ich zog daraus den Schluss, man muss das bekämpfen. Und das habe ich dann getan, so gut ich konnte.
Eugene Levinet's father was the communist leader of the Räterepublik. He was executed in June 1919.
I understand from my mother that he had been very brave the way he met his death. And in fact, he called out, "Long live the world revolution."
Eugene Levinet's father was Jewish. And the anti-Semitic prejudice of those on the right was further fueled by the fact that of the leadership of the Räterepublik, most were Jewish.
Sodass natürlich in Deutschland allmählich der Eindruck entstand, ja, Bolschewismus und Judentum ist dasselbe, so ungefähr. Dass sich allgemein eine anti-jüdische Stimmung verbreitet hat, das finde ich sehr natürlich.
перегородка, которая разделяет российскую революцию от европейской. С нее Спасибо, товарищ. Кто за? А значит, товарищ, сначала Польша, потом Германия, Италия, весь мир! Европейской Федерации мировой революции!
Dr. Adam Weishaupt was born on February 6, 1748, in Ingolstadt, in a city in Bayern, or Bavaria, Germany. This interesting character was the son of a rabbi and converted to Catholicism after his father's death. World-famous central banker Mayer Amschel Rothschild of the Rothschild dynasty chose Weishaupt to create the Coven of Golden Dawn, which to this day is Rothschild's private coven. Rothschild instructed Weishaupt to create the Ancient Illuminated Seers of Bavaria. This is better known as the Order of the Illuminati. The name in Luciferian teachings means the bearer of the light, the illuminated, or the enlightened one. In Nesta Webster's book, The World Revolution, she states, "The art of Illuminism lay in enlisting dupes as well as adepts, and by encouraging dreams of honest visionaries or the schemes of fanatics, by flattering the vanity of ambitious egotists, by working on unbalanced brains, or by playing such passions as greed and power to make men of totally divergent aims serve the secret purpose of the sect. People with money were welcomed but kept oblivious to actual secrets. The purpose is to win power and riches, to undermine secular or religious government, and obtain the masters of the world." Baron Franz Friedrich Knigge was recruited. He was the most instrumental person in the marriage of the Masons and the Illuminati. This allowed the Illuminati to expand rapidly with the use of Masonic lodges. On August 29, 1781, Congress of Wilhelmsbad declared the alliance official.
The result of the French Revolution. 1/3 of the land was owned by the Catholic Church. It was confiscated and sold to the people for gold. 7,000 Roman Catholic priests were killed. The back of the Catholic Church was broken. The monarchy of France was destroyed. The Jews were emancipated in France and most of Europe. Much of France's intelligentsia were murdered and more secret societies set up around Europe.
This photograph was locked up in the archives for 70 years. The Russian people were being told that Lenin was on holiday when it was taken. Monday the 21st of January 1924, the leader of the workers' revolution lay dying in the bourgeois surroundings of a millionaire's mansion.
He moaned quietly. Death settled on his face.
The Jewish banker Jacob Schrift gets the Russian gold. Mr. Bakhmetev, the late Russian imperial ambassador to the United States, tells us that the Bolsheviks, after victory, transferred 600 million rubles in gold between the years 1918 and 1922 to the Kunloeb and Company Bank, that's Schiff's firm in New York. Stalin himself for a long time was regarded as a Georgian, but it has been revealed that he belonged to the Jewish race. Durgachevili, which is his name, son of Dao, and Dao is a small island in Persia where many banished Portuguese Marano Jews migrated, who later settled in Georgia, Russia.
Why is it to this day that most people have not heard of the Holodomor? The Holodomor was one of the largest genocides of the 20th century.
The Ukrainian peasants didn't want to have anything to do with collectivization and fought it. And they fought it much harder than anyone else did. And there were outright battles. I mean, we're talking hundreds of uprisings in 1920-1930.
Stalin's trusted envoy, Pavel Postashev, is given sweeping dictatorial powers and sent into Ukraine with an army of secret police to purge the Ukrainian party ranks and to squeeze out the last kernels of grain. 112,000 trusted party members from Russia are now stationed in Ukraine. They guard the standing crops and livestock from the starving, brutally enforcing the law to protect state property.
Teams of people came into Ukraine and went village by village and removed the food from people's houses. Apples, beets, they would lead away the cows, they would take away whatever was in storage. They passed passport laws that forbade Ukrainians to go, peasantry to go into the cities, and eventually they blocked the entire republic, so people couldn't leave.
Stalin crushed the possibilities of Ukrainian autonomy, Ukrainian self-determination in some ways within the Soviet Union through the actions taken in Holodomor. This was an attack across the board against Ukrainian nationality.
At the height of the famine, in June 1933, people in Ukraine were dying at the rate of 28,000 per day.
If any man, woman or child goes out into the field at night in the summer and picks a single ear of wheat, then the punishment according to law is death by shooting, the communists explained to me.
Jones described what was known as the Law of the 5 Ears of Wheat, signed by Mikhail Kalinin, head of the USSR Central Executive Committee, and Vyacheslav Molotov, head of the Council of People's Commissars. Used judicial repressions of the highest degree as measures of social protection against theft of collective farm property, execution by shooting, and confiscation of all property.
Although there is journalistic writing on this period on it, there were also voices who wished to contradict that testimony. Of course, Walter Duranty is the major case of a liar on these events.
In the early 1930s, Americans received much of their news about life in the Soviet Union from Walter Duranty, the New York Times man in Moscow. Duranty's articles filled the front pages with gripping stories from Mother Russia. During that period, Joseph Stalin was consolidating power over the captive nations that formed the Soviet Union. One step in that drive called for the forced relocation of millions of Ukrainians. Observing these events on the scene was British journalist Malcolm Muggeridge. He witnessed the loading of thousands of Ukrainians into boxcars. They were being deported to barren regions of the Soviet Union.
He was not only the greatest liar among the journalists in Moscow, but he was the greatest liar of any journalist that I ever met. And, when it came to the famine, the great famine in the Ukraine, brought about by collectivization, that was when his reporting was particularly disgraceful, because he denied that there was any famine.
The Soviets actually grant Duranty permission to tour Ukraine unchaperoned. He reports in the Times that all talk of famine now is ridiculous. Yet documents from the British Foreign Office reveal that in private conversations at the British Embassy, Duranty said as many as 10 million people had died.
When they were discussing the question of recognizing the Soviet Union, the United States government recognizing the Soviet Union, the articles of Duranty were considered as very valuable evidence on the side of recognition. But it didn't It worried the New York Times, who featured his reports.
The following year, the Soviet cover-up achieves its ultimate success, a seat in the League of Nations. And this in spite of the fact Western governments knew all about the famine.
The government of Weimar, the democratic government, was well aware of what was going on in the Soviet Union. But the attitude of the government was, I would say, you could call it passive.
Another Times correspondent, Herbert Matthews, also covered for collectivism. During the so-called Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s, communists throughout Spain brutally massacred more than 6,000 priests, friars, and nuns. Matthews' dispatches, however, depicted the communists as idealistic Democrats seeking to liberate Spain from tyranny. No mention was made of the communist atrocities. The establishment media's backing of Matthews and Durante points to the existence of a larger policy to legitimize communism.
Communism is the most absolute form of government. So you actually have in the communist system a rule by an oligarchic few, a rule by an elite. That is precisely what the Council on Foreign Relations insiders have been pushing for in this country and throughout the world throughout the past century. So there is a natural confluence of interest there, not an antagonism between the communists and internationalists here in our government. They are both after the same thing.
Stalin ends the famine with a single decree. Having broken the Ukrainian farmers, he can afford to give out grain on the collectives during the harvest in 1933. 1934. Purges take place in the cities and mark the end of Ukrainian participation in the running of their country as the terror intensifies. The jail cells are rapidly emptied as Ukrainian nationalism becomes an offense punishable by death. The Nazis invite an international commission to inspect the mass graves left from Soviet rule. In the town of Vinnytsia alone, the commission uncovers the bodies of over 9,000 workers, poets, priests. No one can estimate the full total of those who disappeared in Stalin's reign of terror. Ukraine's only crime was that she never adapted to wearing chains.
In many of the places where the famine was most devastating, Russians were brought in to replace Ukrainian villagers. In other words, the nature of the country changed after the famine.
What happens in Ukraine, it wouldn't be wrong to see it as a kind of colonization. It was a horrible blow to Ukrainian national identity, social solidarity, political trust.
I'm not going to do what I usually do and really pick on the Masons tonight. I'm just simply going to read from 2 books of theirs, and I'm going to let the Masons draw their own conclusion. That which we must say to the crowd is, we worship a God, but it is a God that one adores without superstition. To you, sovereigns, grand inspectors general, we say this, that you may repeat it to the brethren of the 32nd, 31st, and 30th degree. The Masonic religion should be, by all of us initiates of the high degree, maintained in the purity of the Luciferian doctrine. If Lucifer were not God, would Abaddon, now before I go on, I want to say Abaddon is found in Revelations for you students of Revelation as the keeper of the pit, the demon over all the rest of the demons. Would Abaddon, the God of the Christians, whose deeds prove his cruelty, profanity, and hatred of men, barbarism, and repulsion for science, would Abaddon and his priests culminate him? Yes, Lucifer is God. Thus, the doctrine of Satanism is a heresy, and the true and pure philosophical religion is the belief in Lucifer, the equal of Abaddon, Jesus Christ. But Lucifer, God of light and God of good, is struggling for humanity against Abaddon, the God of darkness and evil. They're calling Jesus Abaddon. They're calling Lucifer everything we believe of Jesus, and Jesus everything we believe of the devil. And that's in one of their own books.
Who, what, how is Leviathan?
Well, Leviathan is this amazing sea serpent, and it's the greatest creature that God ever created, right alongside to Behemoth. The book of Job talks about Leviathan and Behemoth, and the descriptions are really awesome. Basically, what this is a dragon that lived in the sea. This thing lived in the deep, and it was a terror anytime that it came up and got around men. However, it's more than just that, because the scriptures use Leviathan a few times to describe something else, and that something else is this angelic entity that is high above everything else. So at the end of this description of this earthly creature, and it makes it very clear that it is an earthly creature in the book of Job, it says, he sees everything that is on high. He is the foremost among the sons of pride. And so it really throws you for a loop when you're reading that description, because you think you're reading about this animal, and then all of a sudden you're reading something that sounds like it's about Satan. Because the sons of pride, or the sons of rebellion, are the fallen angels. So we know immediately from that there's something interesting going on with this creature. And then we go to Isaiah 27:1, which is an eschatological verse talking about what's happening in the end times. And that verse says that in the day of the Lord, With his great and strong sword, God is going to punish that serpent, that crooked Leviathan, and he's going to slay that dragon that is in the sea. So he's using an earthly creature to talk about a heavenly creature, and I believe that that is Satan. Many, many times depicted as a serpent in different scriptures, but also in an ancient world. Zeus, king of the gods in Greco-Roman pantheon, depicted as a serpent in many places, many statues throughout the world.
Wow. So how does this relate then to the battle of good and evil? I mean, how does this play out in our world today?
Well, the book of Revelation says that beast comes up out of the abyss in the end times, and he is the last king of the world. So he was the first king of Babylon, and he'll be the last king of Babylon. The religions, I call them occult religions, but they're mystery religions and they're mystery fraternities throughout history. They know that this king has been put away and that he's going to return. Let me give you an example of that. So the Freemasons, when they initiate someone to become a Master Mason, they talk to him as if the great architect of the universe, or what they call God, is speaking to the Master Mason. And this is what this God says. This is a quote. "Seek ye the grave of Hiram, who has carried my will with him to the tomb. This eternal quest is yours, until you have found your builder. No more shall I speak until ye have found and raised my beloved Son, and you have listened to the words of my messenger, and with him as your guide have finished the temple which I shall then inhabit. Amen." End quote. They understand that there's this very important character that has gone to the grave. He has gone to Sheol, just like Ezekiel 31 tells us. But that they need to bring him back. And this is not just the Freemasons. It goes to all the secret societies. They try to get there in different ways, but they're all sort of aiming for the same goal. So they have two goals. One, to bring us to a utopia, at least a utopia for the elites. And then number two, to bring back the world dictator who is supposedly enlightened. You know, Satan's not going into this thing without a plan. He's the first creature ever created, you know, the first thing that Yeshua ever made before even the rest of the universe and the rest of the angels. So we can't underestimate how absolutely capable he is in terms of strategy. In the book, I talk a lot about the occult and the mystery religions and the mystery schools throughout history and what their agenda is and what they have been doing, mostly behind the scenes, to affect human history and to blind us all to what's going on. The scripture actually names him as Asher, and it blew my mind when I realized that, in fact, the Bible is talking about Asher, and it's the name of the Antichrist. So let me talk a little bit about who he was, and I think he was actually Nimrod, and he goes into Egypt and becomes the first king of Egypt and unites that land. There were many tribes there at that time, and he brings them all together. Interestingly, the name Osiris is actually the same as Asher, because in the Egyptian it's Asur. Only the Greeks changed it to Osiris. And there's a very interesting passage in the pyramid texts which talk a lot about Osiris and Isis. But this one particular text says that the Egyptians, when Osiris died, when he was killed, that they preserved his efflux, bodily fluid. That could be blood, could be semen. I think it's the latter, because that contains the complete genome. Do you remember a few years ago when Egyptologists said that they found the tomb of Osiris?
Yes.
Yeah, so they got down there and they found this casket, but it was empty. How do we know whether or not it was really empty, or whether they got down there, understood what they had found, and emptied it out before they brought the cameras down? I don't know if somebody has already found this, but if and when they do, that opens the gate. There is going to be a dark resurrection, and most Christians have no idea. So what I try to show is that this person has already lived. Satan has already used him. He was already the greatest king of Babylon, the greatest king that ever lived. And he will be returning again in the end times. So we're completely unprepared for this dark resurrection to happen, which is why the whole world, Revelation says, will wonder after this beast.
How will we be able to tell? I mean, is it going to be born as an infant and then we have to wait 30 years because he's going to be a false Messiah?
You know, everything Satan does is a mimicry of things that God has done. And so I would suspect that he will bring his Messiah, his false Messiah, into the world as a baby and have him grow up. Because I think he's going to try and fulfill or pretend like he's the fulfillment of a lot of the prophecies in the scriptures about the Messiah, that his reconstructed genetic material might be placed in a virgin, might have already been placed in a virgin, and that it is undergoing that process of growing right now, and then we'll have to wait for a while to see whether or not he shows up. And the Jewish people, we're clearly told in Scripture, are going to be fooled by this. They're going to think that this guy is the Messiah, and they're going to enter into a covenant with him. And then later on will be sorely displeased when he breaks that covenant and tramples them down, takes them away as slaves, and only then will the true Messiah show back up and all of Israel will repent. Let me just say, the occult has been aware of this and planning on bringing him back for thousands of years. And so I dedicate chapters in the book to showing that that is the case, and they know it, and they're looking forward to that day that he can be brought back.
This is a long exploration, frankly. It's going to take some time to elaborate, but there are, basically the eyes wide shut sex parties are real. These things take place. They do have these crystal skull type of things that they, like in the Indiana Jones film, they have a crystal skull. They have these type of skulls they set up at the parties, and they feed the energy into those skulls. They feed the energy into those skulls.
Tired of your tricks. I'm tired of your deceit. I am so tired of your liberal church in America. I'm tired of your witchcraft. This is not an accident. We've swallowed this now for 30 years. And now you depict Jesus as a woman. I'm not going to accept that. I'm a Roman Catholic. I believe in God as Father, creator of heaven and earth. I believe that Jesus is his son, his only son. I believe that he died and he suffered and he rose. Your catechisms are so watered down, they say nothing except love your neighbor. No, you gotta love God first. You gotta live with God in your heart. You can't give what you don't possess. I don't like your church. You have nothing to offer. You do nothing but destroy. And so you plant this mime, a woman is Jesus. You dare do that. We're not going to go for all those crazy things that you're pushing out as new and cultural and American. They're not American. America was built on God. America was built on trust in God. And you've made it pagan because you have no spirituality that attracts. Your whole purpose is to destroy. I am proud to be a Roman Catholic. And I will say mankind instead of humankind. You've been strong too long. I, for one, have a right to be a Roman Catholic without your persecution. And you dare to depict Jesus as a woman. Try it with Martin Luther King. Put a white woman in his place and see what happens. Try it with Moses or Muhammad. No, we're the only ones that can be bashed to the ground and we say nothing. my community and I proclaim to you and to this nation, we are Roman Catholic. We have hidden under bushels too long. We have taken everything and we have been obedient to what? To a destructive force.
The Jewish bankers were financing the Spanish Revolution. During these revolutions, the Catholic Church was always on the receiving end. And then we see the priests, the Catholic priests, fighting revolutionaries in the Spanish Revolution.
It began as any good dream should, with bursts of joy and optimism. When King Alfonso XIII decided to allow elections, socialist and liberal republicans, anarchists and communists swept to overwhelming victories, and the Second Spanish Republic was born. But the flame of hope flickered out in just 2 years amid the poverty and unemployment of the Great Depression. Conservatives won the next election and rolled back many of the changes. The left, incensed, countered with a general strike, but it was shut down by the army. In 1936, power swung back to the left, when the Popular Front, a broad coalition of liberal and socialist groups, eked out a parliamentary majority. The political divide quickly became a chasm. The right, consisting of the military, conservatives, and the Catholic Church, feared for the very survival of Spain. President Manuel Azaña further inflamed the situation as he began reinstituting changes from 1931 that hindered large farms and the church. At the same time, anarchists began pushing Bolshevism, and some conservatives joined the fascist Falange Española. Multiple militias formed on both sides. It was a battleground for idealists. Violence escalated, culminating in a series of assassinations that finally killed democracy. The Civil War exploded with a coup led by General Franco and the army.
Fighting in Spanish Morocco in the early part of the century, Franco had made a name for himself as an energetic and courageous officer. And he was soon given command of the Spanish Foreign Legion, going on to become, at 33, Spain's youngest general. In 1931, to avoid civil war, King Alfonso went into exile. Each side became determined not merely to defeat the other, but to exterminate it. Churches were burned, priests murdered, workers, liberals, leftists were shot down.
The social upheavals of the Republic had led to a progressive breakdown of law and order. In the countryside, peasants hungry to own the land they worked seized it. Some landowners had been killed, and others feared for their lives.
Peace was impossible, so we had to head for the hills. If it's just not possible to live, then you have to find a different solution, which was the rising against the Republic.
In 1936, Hitler had been in power for 3 years. Mussolini had ruled Italy since 1922. In Russia, Stalin had begun the show trials and purges of his enemies. Immediately, both sides sought and found gestures of support from rival sponsors abroad. In the liberal democratic world, individual sympathy for the plight of the Spanish Republic was widespread, but practical help from governments was to prove a different matter. The army rebels' pleas, on the other hand, were soon answered. Two days after the Spanish uprising, Franco had appealed to the Führer for help. Hitler decided to send not the few anti-aircraft guns and fighters that Franco had asked for, but a full squadron of Junkers transport planes to airlift the Spanish Army of Africa from Morocco. 1,500 of these troops were transported to Seville to begin their fighting passage to Madrid. These crack troops of the Spanish army were to play a decisive role in the war. His help was later rewarded with a constant supply of Spanish iron ore.
The nationalists grew stronger. Mussolini added 100,000 men and more firepower. The undermanned Republic, without most of the army, had to arm its citizens and turn to the communists of the Soviet Union for help. Support also came from Mexico and from an unexpected source. More than 40,000 volunteers from 53 nations joined the Republicans, including a group from distant America known as the Lincoln Battalion.
"70 years ago, 500 young Scots risked their lives by volunteering to fight in another country's war. This group of men threw themselves headfirst into the bloody struggle against fascism. A third never returned. They were the Scots who fought Franco. The Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939 was a conflict that gripped Scotland. It was the defining moment for a generation of Scots and, for a time, the country's greatest cause. Proportionately, Scots made a greater contribution than any other nationality. 549 of those volunteers came from Scotland. It was also illegal. At the start of the war, the British government signed up to a non-intervention agreement, outlawing participation in Spain's war and banning the sale of arms to the country. The Scotland those men left behind was far removed from the Scotland of today. It was a time of regular strike action, incendiary street preachers, and a belief in great causes. Scotland stood out in Europe as both one of its poorest countries and one of its most radical. In February 1937, the newly formed British Battalion of the International Brigades had arrived at Jarama and been given the task of stemming a fascist advance on the Spanish capital. Over 100 Scots were involved in wading through the winter mud to wage war. The Battle of Jarama was an almighty slog that set the fault lines for this most bloody of conflicts. The ill-prepared and under-equipped British battalion was left dangerously exposed at Jarama. In the first week of fighting, their entire machine gun company was ambushed and captured by General Franco's Army of Africa, the Moors. Emboldened by the outcome of the battle, the British battalion's leaders planned an offensive at Brunetti, to the west of Madrid. In the baking July heat, optimism soon turned to terror. The British were slaughtered. Of 331 men present on the first day of battle, 289 were killed, wounded or captured. Scots suffered more than most. By the summer of 1937, the Scots who fought Franco were demoralized and had witnessed slaughter on an unimaginable scale. The great cause they had pledged themselves to was ridden with bleak reality. In Spain, their idealism had been severely tested. They had found hell. At the end of August 1938, the Scots who fought Franco were holding firm in Catalonian mountains. They remained deeply committed to the cause, despite monstrous conditions and heavy losses. Yet their fate was set not in battle, but in the corridors of power. In late September, the Republican government announced the withdrawal of the International Brigades. They believed that the move would force Hitler and Mussolini to remove their troops from Spain. It was a forlorn hope. Surviving Scots marched through the streets of Barcelona as part of an emotional farewell parade. The great Republican leader, La Pasionaria, paid tribute to their efforts, telling them, "You can go with pride."
It was an endless, grinding war until Franco tried a new tactic. Living under the constant threat of bombing took its toll, slowly draining away the will of the people and the Republic. In January 1939, Barcelona fell, and Madrid soon followed in March, bringing to a close the Spanish Civil War.
Valle de los Caídos, in Spain, the Valley of the Fallen. Nearly half a century after the Civil War, the men who created and won that war have preserved its massive monument. General Franco called the uprising against the Republican government a crusade, a fight for Christian civilization. It was for nearly 3 years the world's moral arena. Inside this mausoleum today, there is no hint of reconciliation. This huge tomb for Franco's men was hewn in a granite mountain by his defeated enemies, Republican prisoners of war. Behind the altar, the Generalissimo himself, Franco. As a soldier, Franco had served the Republic. He was called a fascist and died a dictator.
Mexican government, during the persecution, any religious act was condemned by the law.
If they didn't fight in that time, we wouldn't have the churches open.
We forget what our grandparents did for our faith. They were risking everything just to go to Mass. They were risking their lives.
They were normal people, and they were called to participate in the defense of their faith, and they willingly said yes to that call.
Part of the greater tragedy of the Cristero movement is that this period in Mexican history has been basically wiped away from the history books.
Mexico in 1926 is reeling from more than a decade of war and violence. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 has failed to create lasting peace. President Plutarco Elias Calles seeks to centralize all power in the hands of the federal government. He views the Catholic Church as an obstacle to his plan. Mexico's 1917 Constitution imposes many restrictions on the Catholic Church. However, these controversial articles are not enforced until President Calles comes to power. Overnight, public worship is forbidden. The government seizes churches and monasteries and exiles foreign priests. Mexican clergy are banned from wearing clerical garb in public and threatened with jail if they criticize the Calles government.
The Mexican government was violently anti-clerical. Not just closing churches, but shooting, hanging, murdering priests.
They were losing their way of life, and at the end, they were forbidden to worship. So they came to a conclusion that they had to resist for dignity. People fought in self-defense, but it was the army against people with stones and bricks and nothing. Many people in the clashes decided that there was no solution but the war.
For the next 3 years, Mexican Catholics wage a guerrilla war against insurmountable odds. They become known as Cristeros, named after their battle cry, Viva Cristo Rey, or Long Live Christ the King. When the Cristero revolt begins, few take the rebellion seriously. Least of all, President Calles. He writes to the French ambassador saying that without Mass and the sacraments, Mexican Catholics will soon forget their faith, and the conflict would be over within a year.
He really believed that. No more Catholic Church, no more fanaticism of the masses, of the Indian masses. And with his hostility, he couldn't understand the strong religious feeling of the Mexican people. So that young man lost all hope, all possibility for a brilliant military career. He was working for cosmetics. And I found a letter of him who said, a general of the Mexican army, making perfume for the lady. What a shame, what a shame.
Despite their limited means, the Cristeros rally around Gorostieta's leadership and grow in numbers and in strength. Their wives and daughters smuggle weapons and ammunition to the front lines.
The only ammunition they got outside from that they take in the battlefield, it was a woman. Without a woman, you don't understand the Cristiada. Without a woman, you have no Cristiada. The Cristiada, at its best moment, counted more than 40,000 rifles, 50,000 in small bands all over the country, and 25,000 in the center-west of the country. Under the supreme leadership of Gorostieta, the Cristeros are climbing.
They say that he was there for the money, or he was there for power because he wanted to become a president. When my grandmother died, she left letters that my grandfather wrote to her. My mother showed them to me. In the letters you can see that he really believed in freedom for the faith.
He discovered the real Christianity in the face of the Mexican people and in the face of his soldiers.
The Knights of Columbus began activities in Mexico in 1905. By the 1920s, the Knights were very active throughout the country. And as the Calles government began to crack down on the Catholic Church, we were also victims and martyrs. Many of our members lost their lives. 2/3 of our councils were shut down by the government. 6 members who were priests have been canonized as martyrs.
In the United States, the Knights of Columbus reacted to the situation, immediately passing a resolution at the Supreme Convention condemning what Calles is doing in Mexico. The Knights had also begun raising $1 million for the purposes of educating the American public about the situation with the persecution.
But the Knights' efforts also raised the specter of anti-Catholicism in the United States. Supporters of President Calles include the powerful KKK.
This caused a lot of criticism of the Knights. This is the 1920s. The 1920s is when the Ku Klux Klan was at its peak in America.
I found in the archives of President Calles telegrams of the Klan, and they say to President Calles, the Knights of Columbus are raising a fund of $1 million for the Mexican Catholic Church. If you need it, we'll raise a fund of $10 million for helping you in your valiant fight.
All this, after 3 years, helped to bring the government to settle things. So they agreed to sign what is known the Los Arreglos in 1929.
The 1929 peace agreement opens the churches and restores religious freedom for Mexican Catholics. But the Constitution remains unchanged, allowing future governments to once again turn the law against the faith. For the Cristeros, the treaty was a death sentence. Fearful of a resurgence, 500 Cristero leaders are rounded up and executed. 5,000 others are purged in what becomes the Cristeros' final sacrifice for religious freedom.
History has approached the Cristero revolt with silence.
I think the example of the men and women that participated in that movement is a great example for us. It's a great lesson for us to learn of how important religious freedom is in our time.
For me, it's more than only something that happened 80 years ago. I think this is something that really is the foundation not only of of Mexico, but I think also of the whole continent. I don't know what would have happened if these brave people wouldn't have stood up for their beliefs.